The Lord is about to reveal ancient markers in your past, signposts you've overlooked that have been pointing to your divine purpose all along. I feel a stirring in my spirit as I share this with you. The veil over your childhood memories is being torn away, revealing a pattern that only heaven could have orchestrated. You've questioned your worth. You've wondered why your path has been marked with such unusual suffering and uncommon wisdom. The enemy has used these very differences to isolate you, but God is reclaiming these markers as evidence of your calling. As C.S. Lewis wrote, "The fact that our heart yearns for something earth can't supply is proof that heaven must be our home." Your heart has always yearned for something more, hasn't it? That longing wasn't madness, it was your spirit recognizing its origins. The first sign was your profound sensitivity. While others moved through childhood with carefree abandon, you felt everything deeply, the joy, the pain, both yours and others. You couldn't understand why a sad story or a wounded animal could devastate you for days, while your friends seemed to forget within minutes. This wasn't weakness. It was a divine receiver being calibrated. The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34, Banding 18. Your sensitivity wasn't a fluid, was your first spiritual gift, unwrapping itself. Remember that teacher, that relative, or that spiritual figure who singled you out. The one who saw something in you that you couldn't yet see. They were an Eli to your Samuel, recognizing the divine voice, calling to you before you had language for it. They may have later betrayed that sacred trust, or failed to nurture what they identified, but their momentary recognition was still part of God's breadcrumb trail in your life. The second sign was your inexplicable knowing. You had insights no child should have had, understanding the undercurrents of adult conversations. Sensing when something wasn't right, despite everyone insisting all was well. For the Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. 1 Corinthians, dois e death. You were tapping into heavenly frequencies, while still learning to navigate earthly ones. I see how this gift became a burden when those around you labeled you as too serious, too intense, or living in your head. They couldn't comprehend that you weren't overthinking. You were perceiving layers of reality they had been trained to ignore. The third sign was your unusual relationship with solitude. While it may have been enforced by rejection or difference, you discovered worlds within the quiet that others feared. You found comfort in creating your own inner landscapes. In books, in imagination, in prayer, or in nature. These weren't escape mechanisms, they were training grounds where God was teaching you to hear His voice above the chaos. Your childhood journals, your private prayers, your make-believe worlds, these weren't childish fantasies. They were prophetic rehearsals for the calling now unfolding in your life. The fourth sign was your struggle with belonging. You tried to fit in, didn't you? You observed others and attempted to mirror their easy social navigation, but something always felt off, like wearing someone else's skin. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Romans 12:2. What seemed like social awkwardness was actually your spirit's resistance to conformity that would have dulled your calling. That childhood friend who betrayed your trust, that youth group that subtly excluded you, that family member who made you feel like the strange one. God is now revealing that these painful rejections were divine protection. You were being preserved from soul ties that would have anchored you to mediocrity. The fifth sign was the questions that got you in trouble. While other children accepted the answers given, you asked why, until adults grew uncomfortable. Your spiritual hunger couldn't be satisfied with prepackaged explanations. Like young Jesus in the temple, your questions weren't rebellion, they were the stirrings of a mind being prepared to challenge fallen systems and restore truth. I know how these questions were often silenced, whether through punishment, dismissal, or religious intimidation. Those who should have nurtured your spiritual curiosity, instead, tried to contain it. Let no one despise you for your youth. 1 Timothy 4:12. God is now restoring your voice and validating that your questions weren't wrong. The suppression of them was. The sixth sign was the unusual trials that marked your childhood. Perhaps it was illness, family instability, early loss, or responsibilities beyond your years. While others enjoyed the carefree nature of childhood, you were being acquainted with hardship in ways that developed unusual maturity. Like Joseph sold by his brothers, what the enemy intended for harm, God was using to position you for purpose. Those premature burdens weren't evidence of divine abandonment, but rather divine investment. Gold requires fire. Diamonds need pressure. Your trials weren't punishment, they were preparation. The seventh sign was moments of inexplicable wonder, spiritual encounters that seemed too profound for your young mind to comprehend. Perhaps it was a dream, a sense of presence, words of knowledge beyond your years, or a peace that made no sense amid your circumstances. Like Samuel hearing his name in the night, God was initiating a conversation that would unfold throughout your lifetime. Those moments weren't imagination or coincidence. They were divine visitations, early investments of the Spirit into a vessel being prepared for extraordinary purpose. What others labeled as your oddness was actually evidence of your calling. The ways you didn't fit were precisely the ways God was setting you apart. Like C.S. Lewis wrote, "We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered us. ... We are far too easily pleased." You couldn't be easily pleased with what satisfied others because you carried the imprint of a higher purpose. The confusion and pain of your childhood are now being redeemed as your greatest qualifications. The enemy knew who you were before you did. That's why the attack on your identity began so early. But what was meant to destroy you has instead distinguished you. Stand firm now as these revelations dawn. Don't retreat into doubt. The very markers that made childhood difficult are the same markers that now confirm your calling. You're not defined by what was done to you, but by what God has been developing through you from the beginning. Has your spirit been stirred as ancient truth awakens within you? Share this declaration in the comments. Chosen before birth, purposed for greatness. Your childhood memories are being illuminated, now not just with nostalgia, but with divine revelation. What appeared as random hardships and peculiar gifts were actually sacred signposts, marking a path few would walk. I've walked a similar road, and I recognize the fingerprints of God all over your story. Those who should have nurtured these signs often became the very ones who tried to extinguish them. The youth pastor who silenced your spiritual insights, the parent who dismissed your sensitivity as weakness, the teacher who labeled your creativity as distraction. They couldn't understand what they themselves hadn't experienced. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Proverbs 19:21. Despite their interference, God's markers remained, waiting to be rediscovered in this season of restoration. Look deeper at these 7 signs, not as isolated events, but as a divine constellation mapping your purpose. Your profound sensitivity wasn't just about feeling more, it was about seeing more. While others perceived only surface reality, you instinctively sensed the spiritual currents moving beneath ordinary moments, like Elisha's servant whose eyes were opened to see the armies of angels. Your sensitivity was a form of spiritual sight, being developed through everyday experiences. This gift became weaponized against you when those with spiritual influence labeled your discernment as rebellion or your empathy as emotional weakness. The natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him. 1 Corinthians 2:14. What they called your overreaction was actually your appropriate response to realities they were too spiritually dulled to perceive. The counterpart to your sensitivity, that inexplicable knowing, was equally misunderstood. You knew things before they happened. You sensed motives behind smiling faces. You discerned truth beneath layers of religious performance. This wasn't some psychic ability. It was the Holy Spirit developing prophetic discernment within you from your earliest years. I understand how this knowing became a burden. How many times did you try to warn others of what you perceived, only to be dismissed as imaginative or negative? How often did you question your own sanity when what you knew to be true was contradicted by everyone around you? This gaslighting wasn't just emotional manipulation. It was spiritual warfare aimed at silencing the prophetic voice being cultivated within you. Your relationship with solitude reveals another layer of your calling. What appeared as social awkwardness or isolation was actually sacred separation. Like John the Baptist in the wilderness, your solitary seasons weren't punishment, they were divine protection and preparation. In those quiet spaces, whether a corner of the playground or a hidden spot in your home. You were developing communion with God that most adults never experience. Those who tried to force you into constant social activity weren't seeing the intimate dialogue happening in your inner world. The authority figures who labeled you as antisocial or withdrawn were unknowingly interrupting holy ground, where your spirit was being formed away from corrupting influences. Your struggle with belonging carried profound spiritual significance. C.S. Lewis captured this perfectly when he wrote, "If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world." Your inability to fully assimilate wasn't a social deficiency, it was spiritual integrity. Your spirit recognized that you were a citizen of another kingdom, and no amount of conformity could silence that awareness. The painful exclusion you experienced from friend groups, family dynamics, or religious communities was actually evidence of your consecration. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. John 17:16. What felt like rejection was often divine redirection, preserving you from attachments that would have compromised your calling. Those troublesome questions that bubbled up from your young heart reveal yet another dimension of your chosenness. Your questioning wasn't defiance. It was discernment, detecting inconsistencies between proclaimed truth and lived reality. Like Jesus, challenging the religious systems of his day, your questions weren't meant to destroy faith, but to purify it. When spiritual authorities responded to your sincere questions with shame, dismissal, or punishment, they weren't protecting truth, they were protecting power structures built on unexamined traditions. Their discomfort with your questions wasn't about your attitude. It was about the fragility of systems that couldn't withstand honest examination. The unusual trials that marked your childhood were divine instruments of character formation. While others were sheltered from hardship, you were being strengthened through it. The family dysfunction, the early losses, the responsibilities beyond your years, these weren't evidence of abandonment, but of accelerated preparation. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. Jeremiah Satu, Banding, Lima. Those premature burdens weren't coincidence or cruelty. They were curriculum designed specifically for someone with an extraordinary calling. The very experiences that seemed to mark you as damaged were actually marking you as chosen. Those moments of wonder, those spiritual encounters that seemed too sacred to share were divine visitations, preparing you for a lifetime of supernatural partnership. The dream that was more than a dream. The voice that spoke with unmistakable clarity. The presence that comforted when no human arms were available. These weren't childhood imagination. They were God initiating covenant with a vessel he had set apart. When adults dismissed these experiences, or even attributed them to darker sources, they weren't just rejecting your testimony, they were rejecting divine initiative in your life. Their inability to validate what you experienced wasn't the final word on its authenticity. Look at these 7 signs together. Now sensitivity, knowing, solitude, non-belonging, questioning, trials, and wonder. Individually, each might be explained away. Together, they form an undeniable pattern of divine selection and preparation. This isn't spiritual elitism. Being chosen isn't about superiority. It's about specific assignment. Like C.S. Lewis noted, it is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest, most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship. The journey from these childhood markers to your present awakening hasn't been linear or simple. There have been detours of doubt, seasons of conformity where you buried these signs in an attempt to find acceptance. There have been spiritual counterfeits who recognized your gifts but tried to exploit them for their own purposes. But these 7 signs remained, written into your very being, waiting for this moment of remembrance and reclamation. What the enemy tried to distort, God is now restoring to their original meaning and purpose. As this revelation settles in your spirit, declare this truth in the comments. My differences were divine design. The awakening happening within you now isn't new creation, it's sacred remembrance. The heavens are thundering with confirmation over your life right now. What was whispered to your spirit as a child is now being shouted from the rooftops. I feel the weight of God's hand as I tell you, The confusion ends today. The questioning of your sanity ends today. The spiritual gaslighting that made you doubt these 7 signs ends today. C.S. Lewis understood this journey when he wrote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." These 7 signs from your childhood are not just memories being reinterpreted. They are the lens through which your entire life suddenly makes sense. Let me speak directly to what happened after these signs appeared in your young life. There was someone, perhaps a spiritual authority, a parent, or another figure of influence who glimpsed your calling and was threatened by it. Instead of nurturing what God had planted, they systematically worked to uproot it. They took your sensitivity and labeled it as weakness. They took your spiritual knowing and called it imagination or rebellion. They pathologized your differences instead of honoring your distinction, for they persecuted the one you struck. And talk about the pain of those you wounded. Psalm 69, banding 26. This spiritual betrayal wasn't random, it was targeted opposition against what God had marked in you. The very people who should have been your covering became your accusers. But here's what the enemy never understood. These 7 signs couldn't be erased because they weren't just experiences. They were your spiritual DNA. Your profound sensitivity wasn't just a personality trait, it was divine equipment. The tears you cried over injustices, others ignored. The way beauty could overwhelm you with its glory. The physical reactions you had to spiritual atmospheres. These weren't emotional excess. They were your spirit, responding to realities your natural senses couldn't yet categorize. This sensitivity became your greatest vulnerability in the hands of manipulators. They learned to weaponize your empathy, making you responsible for their emotional well-being. They discovered how to use your compassion against you, binding you to toxic relationships through false responsibility. What God designed as a gift became the very chain they used to control you. Your inexplicable knowing, that inner witness that could discern truth from falsehood, became the target of their most insidious attacks. Your overthinking, that's just your imagination. You always assume the worst. These phrases weren't casual dismissals. They were calculated attempts to disconnect you from your strongest spiritual antenna. Remember that moment when you knew something was deeply wrong in a spiritual environment everyone else celebrated? Or when you sensed danger while others perceived opportunity? That wasn't anxiety or negativity. Was prophetic discernment functioning exactly as designed. Do not treat prophecies with contempt. 1 Thessalonians 5:20. The contempt shown toward your spiritual perceptions wasn't just personal rejection, it was opposition to the prophetic gift itself. Your relationship with solitude, that sacred space where your spirit flourished while others withered, became portrayed as unhealthy isolation or social deficiency. Those who demanded your constant visibility weren't concerned about your well-being. They were uncomfortable with the unmonitored communion you were having with God. Like David, developing his most profound psalms while watching sheep in solitary fields. Your alone time wasn't emptiness to be filled with activity, was fertile ground where God was planting seeds of wisdom beyond your years. The attempts to invade this space, to fill every moment with noise and distraction, were strategic moves to interrupt divine dialogue. Your struggle with belonging carried the fingerprints of divine selection. C.S. Lewis captured this perfectly. The world does not consist of 100% Christians and 100% non-Christians. There are people in different states of transition, moving either toward or away from the Christian position. Your discomfort in environments that others navigated with ease wasn't social awkwardness. It was spiritual alignment, rejecting false harmony. The painful rejections, the subtle exclusions, the sense of being perpetually misunderstood, these weren't failures of connection, but protection from spiritual compromise. Do not be unequally yoked to Corinthians 6:14 wasn't just about future relationships. It was active in your childhood, preserving you from soul ties that would have anchored you to lesser purposes. Those questions that stirred troubled, the ones that made adults uncomfortable and peers, confused reveal another dimension of your chosenness. Your questioning wasn't disrespect for authority, but respect for truth. Like the Bereans who examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true, Acts 17-11. Your questions weren't undermining faith, but seeking its authentic foundation. When religious systems responded to your questions with shame or silencing, they weren't protecting sacred truths, they were protecting fragile control. Your questions threatened not God's authority, but man's manipulation of it. The discomfort your inquiries created wasn't evidence of your error, but of systems built on unexamined compliance rather than authentic faith. The unusual trials that marked your childhood, those premature burdens, those losses, those responsibilities beyond your years, were not divine punishment but sacred preparation. While others were being raised for comfort, you were being raised for purpose. Like Joseph enduring betrayal, false accusation, and imprisonment, your suffering wasn't absence of favor, but evidence of it. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. Jeremiah Satu Bunding Lima. Your accelerated curriculum of hardship wasn't divine cruelty. It was specialized training. The very experiences that seemed to disqualify you in human systems were qualifying you in divine ones. Those moments of wonder, those spiritual encounters that felt too sacred to share were divine visitations establishing covenant markers in your life. The dream that stayed with you for years. The voice that spoke with unmistakable clarity. The presence that surrounded you when human comfort was absent. These weren't childhood imagination. They were God, initiating relationship with a vessel he had personally selected. When these experiences were dismissed or even demonized by those with spiritual authority, it wasn't just rejection of your testimony, it was opposition to God's personal initiative in your life. Their inability to validate what you experienced wasn't the final word on its reality or significance. Now, as an adult, you stand at a threshold of reclamation. These 7 signs: sensitivity, knowing, solitude, non-belonging, questioning, trials, and wonder are being restored to their original purpose and meaning. What was used to shame you is being reclaimed as evidence of your calling. The painful recognition is this: those who should have been your greatest spiritual allies often became your most damaging spiritual abusers. The youth pastor who exploited your gifts but stifled your voice. The parent who paraded your talents but punished your authenticity. The mentor who recognized your anointing but tried to control its expression. Their betrayal wasn't just personal, it was an attempt to hijack divine purpose. But here's the redemptive turn. What they meant for evil, God meant for good. Even their opposition served to strengthen what they sought to weaken. Your sensitivity grew more nuanced. Your discernment grew more accurate. Your solitude grew more sacred. Your non-conformity grew more purposeful. Your questions grew more precise. Your response to trials grew more resilient. Your spiritual encounters grew more profound. As C.S. Lewis wrote, hardship often prepares an ordinary person for an extraordinary destiny. Your ordinary childhood, marked by these extraordinary signs, was preparation for the mantle you're now ready to carry. Step fully into this awakening. Reclaim these 7 signs, not as wounds to be healed, but as credentials to be honored. You weren't crazy. You weren't too much. You weren't wrong. You were chosen, and everything in your life, both the divine investment and the enemy's opposition, confirms it. Will you declare your reclamation? Share in the comments. What marked me now makes me.